close your eyes for a moment and imagine paradise. Not the paradise of greeting cards or motivational posters, not some sanitized garden with perfectly trimmed hedges and tame animals posing for photographs, but real paradise. The kind that lives in the deepest chambers of human memory, the kind that every culture on earth remembers losing, the kind that haunts our dreams with its impossible beauty and its unbearable absence. Imagine a world before cities, before empires, before the hard labor of agriculture bent our ancestors' backs and shortened their lives. A world of such abundance that hunger was a stranger, of such balance that humans walked among animals without fear, of such plenty that the very concept of scarcity had not yet poisoned the human heart. Picture yourself standing on a coastal plain that no longer exists, drowned now beneath 300 feet of risen sea. But 12,000 years ago, this was the richest landscape on earth. The air is warm but not oppressive, carrying the scent of salt water and flowering plants whose species have long since vanished. To your left, a river wider than any you've seen in the modern world winds through grasslands dotted with groves of fruit trees, their branches heavy with bounty that requires no cultivation, no labor, no anxious planning for winter scarcity. To your right, the sea stretches to a horizon closer than you expect, because the world is different now. The coastline's configured in ways that would make our modern maps unrecognizable. Islands that are now underwater peaks rise green and fertile from waters teeming with fish. The climate is stable, predictable, gentle, none of the violent extremes that will characterize the world after the Ice Age ends, after the catastrophe comes, after paradise is lost. This is the world we call Eden. And tonight, as the boundaries between waking and sleeping grow soft and permeable, as your conscious mind releases its grip on the demands of the present, we're going to explore a possibility that might change how you think about paradise, about history, about the very origins of human civilization itself. What if Eden wasn't just a story? What if the garden wasn't merely metaphor, moral lesson, theological abstraction? What if scattered across the landscape of our planet, beneath risen seas and shifting sands, lie the remnants of a world our ancestors actually knew, actually lived in, actually lost? The familiar story comes to us through the book of Genesis, that ancient text that has shaped Western imagination for thousands of years. In the beginning, God planted a garden in Eden, in the east, a place of perfect harmony, where the first humans walked in fellowship with their Creator, where trees grew heavy with fruit that needed no cultivation, where rivers flowed with clear water, and the naming of animals was the only labor required. The text gives us tantalizing specifics. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah where there is gold. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Ashur. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. 4 rivers, 2 we can identify, the Tigris and Euphrates. Those great waterways that still flow through Iraq today, that still carry the memory of ancient Mesopotamia. But the Pishon and the Gihon, these have puzzled scholars for millennia. Rivers that seem to have vanished, or perhaps rivers that now flow beneath water, channels drowned when the sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. For centuries, explorers and theologians tried to locate Eden. Some placed it in Armenia, where the Tigris and Euphrates have their sources high in the mountains. Others searched in East Africa, following medieval maps that showed Eden near the headwaters of the Nile. Still others looked to the Persian Gulf, to islands like Bahrain, to the marshlands of southern Iraq where the great rivers meet the sea. But all these searches assumed one thing, that Eden, if it existed at all, would still be visible on the modern map, that paradise would be a place we could visit, touch, photograph, prove. What if they were looking in the wrong direction? What if Eden isn't on the map anymore, because it's under the sea? Comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what you imagine when you hear the word paradise. But then, the fall, the expulsion, the angel with the flaming sword barring the way back. Paradise lost through disobedience, through the fatal hunger for knowledge, through the breaking of the one prohibition that stood between humanity and all the suffering that followed. It's a story we think we know, a story we've heard since childhood, a story so familiar that we've perhaps stopped really seeing it, stopped asking the questions that might unlock its deeper meaning. But tonight, we're going to look at it differently, through the lens of archaeology, through the revelations of climate science, through the discoveries that are rewriting our understanding of what the world was like before civilization began. Because something remarkable is happening in our time, something that our grandparents could never have imagined. We're discovering that human history is far older, far more complex, far more sophisticated than the neat timeline we learned in school. The story we were told, the story that says civilization began about 5,000 years ago with Sumer and Egypt. That story is crumbling under the weight of evidence emerging from the earth itself. And in that crumbling, in that revolutionary reassessment of our past, the ancient stories of paradise are taking on new and startling dimensions, taking on the weight of memory rather than mere myth, taking on the possibility of truth. Let's begin with the most revolutionary archaeological discovery of the past century, a discovery so impossible, so contrary to everything we thought we knew, that it forced scholars to completely reconsider human capabilities in the deep past. On a windswept plateau in southeastern Turkey, overlooking the plains that will one day cradle Mesopotamian civilization, stands a hill called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, an unremarkable name for the most remarkable site in archaeology. For decades, centuries, it was just another tell, another ancient mound among thousands that dot the Middle Eastern landscape. Until 1994, when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations and uncovered something that shouldn't exist. Klaus Schmidt was an unusual archaeologist, trained in the rigorous German tradition. He had spent years excavating Neolithic sites across the Near East. He'd worked at Navali Chori, another important early site in Turkey, where he'd seen tantalizing hints that the pre-pottery Neolithic period was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. When a survey team mentioned interesting stone formations at Göbekli Tepe, Schmidt decided to investigate, expecting perhaps a modest Byzantine cemetery, maybe some medieval ruins. What he found instead would consume the rest of his life. Massive stone pillars, some weighing 16 tons, arranged in perfect circles, carved with elaborate images of animals rendered with artistic sophistication that rivals anything from much later periods. Foxes and lions prowling across the limestone, bulls charging, scorpions poised to strike, birds in flight, serpents coiling, wild boars, gazelles, onagers, the menagerie of the Pleistocene preserved in stone. The artistry alone would have been remarkable, but the engineering was even more impressive. These weren't small stones, these were monoliths, quarried from the bedrock half a kilometer away, transported across uneven terrain, erected vertically, some standing 5 meters tall, weighing as much as a fully loaded tractor trailer. The organizational capacity required staggers the imagination. Hundreds of workers, perhaps thousands, coordinated over years, maybe decades. Specialized labor, stone quarriers who could read the rock, engineers who understood leverage and balance, artists who could envision and execute complex designs, architects who could plan circles 20 meters in diameter, and someone or some group with the authority to command all this effort. But here's what makes Göbekli Tepe not just impressive but truly impossible, what makes it revolutionary, what makes it overturn everything we thought we knew about the development of civilization. It's 11,600 years old. Let that number sink into your consciousness. 11,600 years, carbon dates from organic material embedded in the mortar, from charcoal in ancient fire pits, from bone tools left by the builders, all clustering tightly around 9,600 BCE, a time when humans were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers. living in small nomadic bands, following game animals, gathering wild plants, with no permanent settlements, no complex social organization, no monumental architecture whatsoever. Built before pottery, the builders of Göbekli Tepe had not yet invented fired clay vessels, before the wheel, before metalworking, before agriculture, before domesticated animals, before permanent villages, before everything we thought had to come first, before all the prerequisites we assumed were necessary for this kind of achievement. It's as if someone built a cathedral before anyone had invented houses, before the concept of permanent structure had even entered human consciousness. It's finding a skyscraper in a world that hasn't discovered bricks. And yet, there it stands. Schmidt's team spent 2 decades carefully excavating, working with a team of Turkish archaeologists and international collaborators, carefully documenting each discovery, photographing, measuring, preserving. Schmidt understood that Göbekli Tepe was rewriting human history, that every season of excavation brought revelations that challenged fundamental assumptions about our past. He worked tirelessly, publishing papers, giving lectures, welcoming researchers from around the world to study the site, until his sudden death in 2014, leaving the work unfinished but having changed forever how we understand the dawn of civilization, revealing one astonishing and remarkable circle after another. More than 20 major circular structures discovered so far, with geomagnetic surveys suggesting hundreds more still buried beneath tons of accumulated soil. Each circle required thousands of hours of labor. Each represents a triumph of human cooperation and vision. The T-shaped pillars that form the circles are particularly intriguing. Some researchers believe they represent stylized human figures. The T could be simplified shoulders and head, arms held at the sides. Many have what appear to be hands carved at their bases, as if these silent stone sentinels are reaching forward, grasping, holding. Perhaps they represent ancestors, perhaps gods, perhaps the builders themselves, transformed into eternal guardians of sacred space. Schmidt's team noticed something else, something that deepened the mystery, and suggested a narrative arc to the site. The earliest circles, those built 11,600 years ago, are the most sophisticated, the largest, the most ambitious. Pillars weighing 16 tons, circles 20 meters across, artistic sophistication at its peak. As time passes, as newer circles are built in the centuries following, they become smaller, simpler, less impressive. The pillars shrink, the circles narrow, the carvings become cruder, as if the builders were losing something, forgetting something, declining from some earlier peak of capability. This pattern contradicts everything we thought we knew about human cultural evolution. We assume continuous improvement, progress, building on the past, standing on the shoulders of giants, always advancing, always becoming more sophisticated. But Göbekli Tepe suggests something different. It suggests that at the very end of the Ice Age, at that crucial moment of climate transformation, humans possessed capabilities and knowledge that would soon be lost, that the transition out of the Ice Age wasn't just progress, but also loss, a forgetting as much as a remembering. Schmidt believed the site was a temple complex, a pilgrimage destination drawing hunter-gatherer bands from across the region, perhaps hundreds of kilometers. He imagined seasonal gatherings, times when the scattered bands would converge, bringing offerings, sharing rituals, exchanging partners to maintain genetic diversity, trading goods and stories and knowledge, forging the social bonds that would eventually make civilization possible. The animal bones scattered around the site tell a story of feasting on a massive scale. Gazelle, wild cattle, wild sheep, wild boar, tens of thousands of bone fragments, evidence of enormous communal meals, food enough for hundreds, perhaps thousands. This wasn't a settlement. No one lived here permanently. It was a gathering place, a sacred center in a world of mobile hunter-gatherers. But Schmidt saw something else in Göbekli Tepe, something that connects directly to Eden, to paradise. to that persistent human memory of a golden age lost. In his papers and lectures, Schmidt would speak of what he called the paradise motif, the idea that Göbekli Tepe might be humanity's first attempt to commemorate the loss of the hunter-gatherer paradise. He pointed to the animal carvings, all wild species, no domesticated animals anywhere. The builders were still living as hunter-gatherers, even as they created this monumental sacred space. He noted the absence of residential structures, of storage facilities, of all the infrastructure you'd associate with settled agricultural life. Göbekli Tepe was built at the threshold, on the edge between two worlds, between the old way of life that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years and the new way that was beginning, between abundance and scarcity, between paradise and the fall. And here's the timing that makes everything click into place. Göbekli Tepe was built 11,600 years ago, right as the Younger Dryas was ending, right as humanity was emerging from 12 centuries of climate catastrophe, right at the moment when the Ice Age world was dying and something new, something harder, something requiring agriculture and settlement and all the baggage of civilization, was being born. After several centuries of use, probably around 10,000 BCE, the builders did something extraordinary. They deliberately buried the entire complex, filled in the excavations with thousands of tons of earth and rubble, covered the magnificent pillars, sealed the circles, created an artificial hill that would protect the site for millennia, and then they walked away. Why? Why create something so monumental, and then bury it? Schmidt believed they were closing a chapter, sealing away the past, acknowledging that the old world was truly gone, that the hunter-gatherer paradise was finished, that it was time to move forward into a new reality, the reality of agriculture, of permanent settlement, of property and hierarchy, and all the complications of civilization, the reality of Eden after the fall, because Göbekli Tepe was built at a very specific moment in Earth's history, at the very end of the last ice age, at that crucial transition when the climate that had prevailed for 100,000 years was giving way to something new, something unpredictable, something terrifying. The Ice Age world was fundamentally different from our own. For most of the past 100,000 years, much of the planet's water was locked up in enormous ice sheets, some more than 2 miles thick, covering Canada, northern Europe, parts of Asia. These glaciers contained so much water that global sea levels stood 300 feet lower than today. 300 feet. That's 100 meters. That's the height of a 30-story building. Imagine that much ocean drained away, revealing the continental shelves, exposing vast areas that are now seafloor, creating an entirely different map of the world. The Bering Strait, that narrow passage between Russia and Alaska, was actually Bering Sea, a landmass the size of Texas connecting the continents. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to France and the Low Countries by the plains of Doggerland. Indonesia wasn't a chain of islands but part of a continent-sized landmass called Sunderland. The Persian Gulf, that body of water separating Arabia from Iran, was mostly dry land, a fertile river valley. These submerged lands weren't barren. They were among the most productive environments on Earth. Coastlines, estuaries, river mouths. These are where life concentrates, where nutrients accumulate, where diverse ecosystems overlap to create extraordinary abundance. The Ice Age coastlines, now drowned, were paradise for hunter-gatherers. The global climate during the Ice Age was also, paradoxically, more stable in some ways than what we've experienced since. Less variability between seasons, fewer extreme weather events, more predictable patterns of resource availability for hunter-gatherers living by intimate knowledge of their environment. This stability was everything. This predictability allowed populations to thrive, to develop sophisticated cultures, to accumulate knowledge across generations. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers in rich environments show they typically work only 3 to 4 hours per day on subsistence activities. The rest is spent in what we might call leisure, socializing, storytelling, making art, playing music, dancing, resting. This wasn't poverty, this was abundance. The original affluent society, as anthropologist Marshall Salins called it. This was the world humans evolved in, the world our brains and bodies are adapted to, the world that shaped our deepest instincts about what life should be like. This was paradise, not supernatural, but the natural world in its ice age abundance. And then everything changed. Around 12,900 years ago, the gradual warming that had been occurring for several thousand years suddenly reversed. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged back toward glacial conditions, not gradually but shockingly fast, perhaps within a single generation, perhaps even within a single decade. The climate shift was so sudden and severe that it shows up clearly in every kind of evidence we can examine. Ice cores from Greenland show oxygen isotope ratios, flipping like a switch. Tree ring data from ancient bristlecone pines reveal sudden growth suppression. Pollen records show temperate forests replaced almost instantly by tundra species. Ocean sediments record dramatic changes in water temperature and salinity. The event is called the Younger Dryas, named after Dryas octopetala, an alpine tundra wildflower that suddenly appears in the European pollen record, replacing the temperate forest species that had been expanding. It's as if someone turned off summer and winter came and stayed for 1,200 years. Glaciers that had been retreating for thousands of years suddenly advanced again. The ice sheets thickened, expanded, forests died and were replaced by tundra, lakes dried up or froze solid. The great herds of megafauna that had sustained human hunters for tens of thousands of years began their march toward extinction. Mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, all would be gone by the time the Younger Dryas ended. Human populations crashed. Genetic studies suggest a significant bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in human numbers during this period. Many regional populations simply disappeared from the archaeological record, their sites abandoned, their cultures ended, their knowledge lost forever. The survivors faced a world transformed. The abundance they had known was gone. The climate stability that had characterized the Ice Age was shattered. Resources became unpredictable, scarce, fiercely competed for. This was catastrophe on a scale almost impossible to imagine. What caused the Younger Dryas? The traditional theory involved massive freshwater pulses from melting ice sheets disrupting ocean currents, but in recent years, a more dramatic hypothesis has gained traction. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. Researchers including James Kennett of UC Santa Barbara, Alan West, and the late Richard Firestone propose that around 12,900 years ago, Earth passed through the debris field of a fragmenting comet. Multiple fragments struck the North American ice sheet, releasing catastrophic energy. The evidence they've assembled is compelling. At more than 50 sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, researchers have identified a thin black layer dated precisely to 12,900 years ago. This Younger Dryas boundary layer contains extraordinary materials, nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds forming only under extreme pressure and temperature, melted glass spherules, created when sand is heated to thousands of degrees, high concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements rare on Earth's surface, but common in comets, magnetic microspherules, impact debris, carbon spherules suggesting massive wildfires, shocked quartz showing impact deformation. Computer models suggest the impacts would have instantly vaporized trillions of tons of ice, throwing water vapor into the atmosphere, while ejected debris falling back to Earth would have heated the atmosphere, igniting continent-spanning wildfires. The combination would have created impact winter, blocking sunlight for years, triggering the climate collapse. Critics question some evidence, propose alternatives. But proponents respond with additional research, more sites, refined dating, sophisticated analysis. The debate continues, but what's clear is that 12,900 years ago, something catastrophic happened. The climate collapsed. The extinctions were real. The human suffering was immense. And Göbekli Tepe was built immediately after, as survivors emerged from 12 centuries of catastrophe, perhaps to preserve what remained, to commemorate what was lost, to create a permanent reminder of the world before the fall. The survivors of the Younger Dryas would have witnessed transformation on an almost incomprehensible scale. Imagine being a young hunter, taught by your grandparents about the old world, about the abundance that once existed, about the megafauna herds that stretched to the horizon, and now, in your own lifetime, watching those herds dwindle, watching species disappear, watching the climate become more erratic, more unpredictable, more hostile. The mammoths your grandfather hunted, now rare, now dying out. The forests your grandmother gathered from, now replaced by tundra, now unable to provide the reliable patterns of resource availability, the knowledge passed down for generations about when and where to find food, suddenly obsolete, suddenly useless in a world that no longer follows the old rules. This would have been deeply traumatic, not just materially, not just in terms of survival, but spiritually, psychologically. The world you were taught to expect, the world you were raised to understand, that world no longer exists. Everything your elders told you, everything you learned as a child, it no longer applies. You must adapt or die. And many didn't adapt. The archaeological record shows regional population collapses across the northern hemisphere during the Younger Dryas, entire cultures disappearing, sites abandoned, tool traditions ending, genetic lineages terminating. The bottleneck in human population wasn't just about numbers, it was about the loss of accumulated knowledge, the severing of cultural continuity, the death of wisdom that had taken generations to develop. Those who survived, those who adapted, they did so at tremendous cost. They had to abandon tried and true methods, had to experiment with new strategies, had to take risks that their more conservative ancestors never would have taken. They had to become creative in ways that stability never requires. Perhaps this is when human innovation truly accelerated, not from abundance, but from necessity, not from comfort, but from desperation. The crisis of the Younger Dryas may have forced the cognitive flexibility, the problem-solving creativity, the willingness to try new approaches that would eventually lead to agriculture, to domestication, to settled life, to civilization as we know it. But it came at the cost of the old wisdom, the old balance, the old harmony with nature that had characterized the Ice Age world. The survivors carried forward fragments, memories, stories of how it used to be, but the lived reality of hunter-gatherer abundance was increasingly distant, increasingly mythologized, increasingly transformed into paradise lost. If you're finding these connections between myth and reality fascinating, take a moment to like this video, because here's what emerged from the catastrophe. Here's what characterizes the world after 11,700 years ago, when the climate finally stabilized: agriculture. Around 11,000 years ago, in multiple locations across the Fertile Crescent, humans began deliberately planting seeds, cultivating crops, domesticating animals. The agricultural revolution, traditionally presented as human progress, as innovation enabling civilization. But anthropologists studying the transition uncovered a troubling reality. The bones tell the story. Early agriculturalists were shorter on average than their hunter-gatherer predecessors, sometimes by 6 inches. Their skeletons show signs of nutritional stress, Harris lines on bones indicating childhood malnutrition. Their teeth were disasters, riddled with cavities from carbohydrate-heavy diets. Their bones reveal wear patterns from repetitive labor, arthritis from grinding grain, digging, planting, harvesting. They died younger. They worked far more hours. Studies suggest early agriculturalists might have worked 10 to 12 hours daily just to produce enough food, compared to 3 to 4 hours for hunter-gatherers. They were more vulnerable to famine when crops failed, more vulnerable to disease in crowded settlements. In almost every measurable way, Early agriculture made life harder, not easier. So why did people adopt it? Not because they wanted to, because they had to, because the old ways no longer worked, because the Ice Age abundance was gone, because the megafauna were extinct, because populations that had grown couldn't be supported by hunting-gathering anymore. Agriculture emerged from necessity, not from humans wanting to work harder, but from having no choice to survive. This is the fall. This is what Genesis describes, not moral failure but environmental transformation, not punishment but adaptation, not the end of innocence through disobedience, but the end of abundance through climate catastrophe. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your bread. This isn't metaphor. This is description, accurate description of what agriculture is, ground-level experience of the transition from hunter-gatherer abundance to agricultural toil, encoded in theological language, but preserving memory of real transformation. To the woman he said, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children." Agricultural women have more children, spaced closer together. They wean earlier with grain porridge, become pregnant again more quickly, experience more difficult births, die more often in childbirth. This isn't punishment for sin, it's medical reality of agricultural transition. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, perhaps it represents agriculture itself, the knowledge that allowed survival in the post-paradise world, but with terrible costs. The knowledge that brought population growth and technology, but also warfare and slavery and environmental degradation. The knowledge that made us powerful, but cost us our innocence, our balance with nature, our place in the garden. The imagery of the fall itself, when examined closely, contains remarkable echoes of the climate transformation. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. This isn't just about moral awareness, it's about the loss of the easy relationship with nature. When you live in paradise, when resources are abundant, you don't need elaborate clothing, you don't need stored food, you don't need complex shelters. But when scarcity comes, when you must work hard to survive, suddenly you become aware of your vulnerability, your nakedness before the elements, your dependence on tools and technology and labor to survive. They sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. The first technology, the first manufacture, born from necessity, from awareness of vulnerability. This is the hunter-gatherer becoming agricultural, becoming dependent on making things, on accumulating things, on protecting the self through artifice rather than through harmony with nature. They heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. The loss of easy intimacy, the introduction of shame, fear, the sense of having transgressed. Perhaps this captures the psychological transformation that came with the adoption of agriculture, the guilt of controlling nature rather than living within it, the awareness that in gaining power over the environment, something essential has been lost. And there's no going back. Once you've eaten from the tree, once populations have grown through agriculture, you can't return to hunting-gathering. There are too many people. The angel with the flaming sword bars the way back. Now let's turn to the physical geography of Eden, to those 4 rivers, to the specific locations Genesis describes with such unusual precision. We know the Tigris and Euphrates. They still flow today through Iraq, but the Pishon and Gihon have defied identification for millennia. Rivers mentioned in Genesis but seemingly absent from the modern map. Until marine geologist Juris Zarins of Southwest Missouri State University began studying satellite imagery and geological data from the Persian Gulf region, Zarins noticed something remarkable. During the Ice Age, with sea levels 300 feet lower, the Persian Gulf was not a body of water, but mostly dry land, a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates, instead of emptying into the Gulf as today, would have flowed together through this valley, creating a much larger river system. And they would have been joined by other rivers. Rivers draining from the Arabian Peninsula to the west, rivers flowing from the Zagros Mountains of Iran to the east, rivers that are now beneath the sea, using radar imaging that can penetrate shallow water and detect underlying geological structures. Zarins identified what appear to be two major river channels beneath the Gulf. The Wadi Batin, once the Wadi al-Rumma, which drained eastern Arabia, and the Karun river system, which drained the Iranian highlands. Could these be the Pishon and Gihon? The description fits remarkably well. The Wadi Batin flowed through regions of Arabia known for gold deposits and semi-precious stones, matching Genesis's description of Havilah. Where the gold of that land is good, aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The Karun system flowed through lands some ancient texts called Kush, matching the Gihon's described territory. Zarins proposed that during the Ice Age, this river valley at the head of the Persian Gulf, where four major rivers met, would have been ideal for human habitation. Fresh water from multiple sources, fertile alluvial soil deposited by rivers, diverse ecosystems, all moderate climate, protected by surrounding highlands, everything needed for hunter-gatherer paradise. Archaeological evidence is limited, because most Ice Age surfaces are now underwater, but on remaining highlands, on islands like Bahrain and along current coastlines, archaeologists have found tools and settlements dating to before the flooding. The Ubaid culture flourishing in Mesopotamia, from about 6,500 to 3,800 BCE shows sophisticated development, suggesting they built on even earlier traditions. The Ubaid people created extensive irrigation systems, large settlements, long-distance trade networks. They built the first temples at sites like Eridu, which later Sumerians considered the first city, where civilization began. Perhaps Eridu was founded by people from the drowned Gulf Valley, people maintaining, on dry land, connection to paradise lost beneath the waves. Around 8,000 years ago, as Ice Age glaciers finished melting, sea levels rose to approximately current height. The Persian Gulf Valley was gradually flooded, rising waters advanced year by year, generation by generation, slow enough that people could retreat, but fast enough that within lifetimes, the landscape was utterly transformed. People fleeing this flooding would have carried memories of the valley they'd lost, memories of where four rivers met, memories of abundance and stability, memories eventually encoded in myth, written in Genesis, preserved for thousands of years as the story of Eden. Geoffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham took Zarin's theory further, proposing the drowned Gulf Valley was not just inspiration for Eden stories, but actually a center of human cultural development during the Ice Age, a place where populations thrived, where knowledge accumulated, where foundations of later civilizations were laid. The timing fits perfectly. The Gulf was dry during the Ice Age. It began flooding around 8,000 years ago, just before earliest evidence of complex societies in Mesopotamia. Refugees from flooding would have carried their cultural achievements, their accumulated knowledge, their memories of paradise to highlands, eventually developing into Ubaid culture, then Sumer, then all great Mesopotamian civilizations. Marine archaeologists have found evidence of human habitation on what is now Gulf seafloor, stone tools, shell middens, traces of settlements beneath salt water. Evidence is fragmentary, difficult to excavate, but it's there, proving people lived on land that is now sea, and the pattern of flooding matches drowned paradises worldwide. Consider Doggerland, that vast territory once connecting Britain to continental Europe. During the Ice Age, Doggerland wasn't sea but land, an area approximately the size of modern Britain, stretching from eastern England to the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, a landscape of rolling hills, winding rivers, forests rich with game, coastlines offering abundant seafood. Geophysicist Richard Bates of the University of St Andrews spent years mapping Doggerland using seismic survey data, acoustic imaging, core samples from the North Sea bed. His research revealed an extraordinary lost landscape. He identified an enormous river system, larger than the Thames and Rhine combined, that once flowed across Doggerland, its main channel perhaps 300 meters wide, flowing from Norwegian mountains southward across the plain, fed by countless tributaries. Around this river, Bates's team identified what appear to be ancient lakes, wetlands, coastal lagoons, all features of productive landscape capable of supporting substantial human populations. And indeed, fishing trawlers operating in the North Sea have brought up numerous prehistoric artifacts, worked flints, bone tools, carved antler, even fragments of possible wooden structures. Doggerland's drowning was gradual, taking thousands of years, but around 8,200 years ago, it suffered catastrophic blow. The Storge Slide, a massive underwater landslide off Norway's coast, triggered by earthquakes as ice sheets adjusted. This landslide, involving 300 cubic kilometers of material, generated a mega-tsunami. Evidence of this tsunami has been found around the North Sea. Marine sediments deposited high above normal sea level, sudden disruptions in coastal settlements. The tsunami would have swept across whatever remained of low-lying Doggerland. Any population still there would have been annihilated in hours. Survivors, those already on higher ground, would have carried traumatic memories, stories contributing to European flood myths. Or consider Sunderland, the vast Southeast Asian continent that existed during the Ice Age, connecting the Malay Peninsula with Sumatra, Java, Borneo, an area larger than India, spanning millions of square kilometers, a tropical paradise of rainforests and river valleys. Geneticist Stephen Oppenheimer of Oxford University studied Southeast Asian population history through DNA analysis. His research suggests Sunderland may have been a major center of human population and culture during the Ice Age, possibly the origin point for seafaring populations that eventually colonized Melanesia, Polynesia, the Pacific Islands. When sea levels rose, Sunderland was gradually drowned, coastlines retreated, river valleys became straits and seas, mountains became islands, populations in lowlands were driven to higher ground, becoming ancestors of modern Indonesians, Malaysians, Filipinos. They carried memories of vast lowlands now lost beneath the South China Sea and Java Sea, memories preserved in flood myths and paradise stories throughout the region. Melanesians tell stories of when their islands were connected, when you could walk from one to another, when land extended far beyond current coastlines. Polynesians preserve traditions of ancestral homelands in the West, lands lost to the sea, lands from which ancestors voyaged eastward across the Pacific. The pattern repeats everywhere. Beringia, the land bridge connecting Asia to North America, was once vast Arctic grassland called the Mammoth Steppe, supporting enormous herds and human hunters. When the Ice Age ended, it was submerged beneath the Bering Strait. Native American traditions speak of ancestors crossing from the west of a time before waters separated continents. The Adriatic Plain, once fertile farmland where Neolithic peoples cultivated crops, is now the Adriatic Sea. The Black Sea, once a freshwater lake surrounded by thriving settlements, was catastrophically flooded when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus around 7,500 years ago. Marine archaeologist Robert Ballard explored the Black Sea floor in the 1990s and found evidence of ancient shorelines, freshwater species suddenly replaced by marine species, possibly even human structures beneath the waves. Everywhere, the same story: coastal paradise during the Ice Age, then flooding as glaciers melted, then loss, displacement, trauma, and then memory. Memory encoded in myth, memory preserved across millennia. But flooding wasn't the only catastrophe. Climate changes affected inland areas, transforming green landscapes into deserts and wastelands. The Sahara, one of Earth's most inhospitable regions, was green during much of the last Ice Age, and for several thousand years afterward. The African humid period, lasting from about 14,800 to 5,500 years ago, brought abundant rainfall to North Africa. The Sahara filled with lakes and rivers, grasslands and forests, supporting elephants and hippos, giraffes and antelope, thriving human cultures. The evidence is everywhere in rock art, tens of thousands of images painted and carved on cliff faces across the Sahara, showing cattle herds and hunting scenes, boats and fishermen, people swimming in rivers. These images aren't fantasy. They're documentary evidence of a landscape that existed, a green Sahara supporting pastoral peoples for thousands of years. Then, around 5,500 years ago, the African monsoon system shifted northward. The rains that sustained the green Sahara failed. Climate scientist Peter Domenical of Columbia University studied marine sediment cores from off West Africa's coast. These cores contain dust layers, pollen records, climate indicators tracking the pace of change. His research shows the transformation happened with shocking speed within just a few centuries, perhaps even a few generations. The Sahara went from savanna to desert. Enough rain to support agriculture one generation, barely enough to survive the next. People living through this experienced it as the literal death of their world, as paradise turning to wasteland before their eyes. They fled, moving to the Nile Valley where the river still flowed, or northward to Mediterranean coasts, or southward towards sub-Saharan forests. They carried memories of green lands lost, memories surviving in North African traditions, in stories of when water was abundant, when the desert bloomed. The Fertile Crescent itself, that arc from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia to the Levant and Egypt, was far more fertile in the past. Pollen records and paleoclimate data show regions now arid once received significantly more rainfall. Forests covered areas now scrubland. Rivers flowed where now there are dry wadis. Soil was richer, less eroded, more productive. The transformation took thousands of years but was inexorable. Early agriculture emerged in the Fertile Crescent, not because people there were more innovative, but because they had to be. The early agricultural settlements reveal the struggle of this transition in poignant detail. At Jericho, archaeologists have found not just the famous stone walls, but also a tower, a massive stone structure 10 meters in diameter and 8 meters high, built around 8000 BCE, one of the oldest stone structures ever discovered. The tower's purpose remains debated. Some argue it was defensive, others suggest it was a watchtower for tracking the summer solstice, still others propose it was a response to flooding. But what's undeniable is the massive labor investment it represents. Hundreds of people working for months or years, moving tons of stone, coordinating their efforts. This wasn't a casual project. This was a community under pressure, investing heavily in infrastructure that earlier hunter-gatherers never would have needed. The Ubaid culture, flourishing in southern Mesopotamia from about 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, shows even more sophisticated adaptation to the new realities. They created extensive irrigation systems, channeling water from the Tigris and Euphrates to fields that would otherwise have been too dry for cultivation. They built large villages and towns, some housing thousands of people. They developed specialized crafts, pottery styles distinctive enough that archaeologists can track trade networks across hundreds of kilometers. The Ubaid temple complexes, particularly at Eridu, show increasing architectural sophistication over time. The earliest temples are modest, simple single-room structures, but each successive rebuild becomes larger, more complex, more ornate. By the final phase, around 4500 BCE, the temple at Eridu is a substantial building with multiple rooms, decorated with elaborate painted designs, positioned on a raised platform, foreshadowing the ziggurats that would come later. What were they building? What were these temples for? The Sumerian texts that come later, thousands of years later, tell us that Eridu was the house of Enki, god of the sweet waters, god of wisdom, god of the Abzu, that primordial fresh water beneath the earth. The temple faced toward the Persian Gulf, toward the waters that had drowned the ancient river valley, perhaps toward the drowned paradise itself. Were the Ubaid people? Were the builders of Eridu descendants of refugees from the Gulf Valley, people who had fled the rising seas, who carried memories of the paradise beneath the waves, who built their temple as a memorial, as a connection to what had been lost? We can't know for certain, but the symbolism is striking. A temple to the god of fresh water and wisdom, positioned at the northern edge of the drowned valley, facing toward the sea that had taken the land, built and rebuilt and enlarged over centuries, as if each generation was recommitting to the memory, reaffirming the connection to paradise lost. The Ubaid pottery, found across the entire region from the Persian Gulf to eastern Turkey, from western Iran to the Mediterranean coast, shows a remarkable uniformity of style, suggesting not just trade but shared cultural identity, shared beliefs, shared stories, perhaps shared memories of the world that had been transformed now into myth, into religion, into the founding narratives of Mesopotamian civilization, because easy Ice Age abundance was giving way to drier conditions, to the necessity of controlling food production rather than relying on what nature provided. Archaeological sites across the region tell this story. Jericho, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, was established around 9600 BCE at an oasis in the Jordan Valley. It's surrounded by massive stone walls, not primarily against human enemies, but against flooding from the Jordan River. People who built Jericho were adapting to new environmental challenges. Çatalhöyük, in central Turkey, flourished from about 7500 to 5700 BCE, one of the world's first true cities, housing perhaps 8,000 people at its peak, houses packed together with no streets. People entered through roofs, an intensely urban environment showing transition from dispersed hunter-gatherer bands to concentrated agricultural settlements. The art at Çatalhöyük is revealing. Bulls and vultures dominate, symbols associated with death and transformation. People buried their dead beneath house floors, sometimes excavating previous burials to retrieve skulls which they plastered and painted. They were literally living on top of ancestors, maintaining physical and spiritual connection with the past even as they moved into an uncertain future. These early agricultural settlements weren't paradise. They were paradise's aftermath, humanity's adaptation to paradise lost, the beginning of the long road that would lead to cities and empires but also to warfare and slavery, hierarchy and inequality. Consider subscribing to Simply About Earth, where curiosity finds its quiet corner and wonder takes its time. Now let's explore how other cultures remembered this transformation, because the Eden story, while uniquely detailed, is far from unique in its basic narrative. The Sumerians, whose civilization emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, preserved paradise myths, predating the biblical account by thousands of years. They spoke of Dilmun, the land where the sun rises, a place of perfect harmony where sickness and death did not exist. In the Sumerian poem Enki and Ninazag, we learn Dilmun was pure, clean, bright. In Dilmun the raven utters no cries, the lion kills not, the wolf snatches not the lamb. Unknown is the kid-devouring wild dog, the dove droops not the head. But Dilmun had no fresh water, so Enki, god of wisdom and sweet waters of the Abzu, called up water from the earth. He laid her the city by the river mouth. He laid Dilmun by the river mouth. Sumerians located Dilmun to the east, in the direction of sunrise. Early scholars identified it with Bahrain, where archaeological excavations found extensive remains of Bronze Age civilization. But perhaps Bahrain was the refuge, the highland that remained when original Dilmun, the Gulf Valley paradise, was drowned by rising seas. Sumerians also spoke of the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, source of all rivers and wisdom. Enki dwells in the Abzu in his palace, Abzu, surrounded by gardens. This imagery connects directly to the four rivers description in Genesis, to paradise as source of all flowing waters. Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, according to their traditions, was built at the northern edge of what had been the Gulf Valley. Its temple was dedicated to Enki and called Abzu, the House of the Abzu. Perhaps Eridu was founded by refugees from the drowned valley, people who built their temple facing toward waters that had swallowed their homeland. The ancient Greeks preserved similar myths in accounts of the Golden Age, the first and best age of humanity. Poet Hesiod describes it in his Works and Days. In the beginning, the immortals who dwell on Olympus created a golden race of mortal men. These lived in the time of Kronos, when he ruled in heaven, and they lived like gods, with hearts free from sorrow, and without toil and grief. The fruitful earth bore them abundant fruit without stint. Then came the Silver Age, less perfect. Then the Bronze Age, warlike and violent. Then the Age of Heroes, and finally the Iron Age, our own time. Would that I were not among the fifth generation of men, but either had died before or been born afterwards. For now is a race of iron, and men never rest from labour and sorrow by day, and from perishing by night. Again, the same pattern: decline from paradise, loss of abundance, introduction of toil and suffering. The Roman poet Ovid elaborated in his Metamorphoses. The Golden Age was first, which of its own accord, without law, without compulsion, cultivated faith and righteousness. Punishment and fear were absent. Spring was eternal. The rivers flowed with milk, and rivers flowed with nectar, and honey dripped from the green oak. This isn't just poetry. It's cultural memory, memory of climate stability, of natural abundance, of the world before agriculture made survival dependent on human labor. Norse mythology preserved similar traditions. The Prose Edda speaks of Ithavol, the primordial paradise, where the Usa gods lived in the beginning, where they built halls and temples, where they played with golden gaming pieces. This was before the ordering of the cosmos into its current form, before Odin's sacrifice, before complex hierarchies of the world as we know it. Paradise lost not through sin but through necessity, through transformation that brought wisdom and power, but ended primordial innocence. Chinese traditions preserved in texts like the Huinanzi speak of primordial paradise, when humans lived in harmony with the Tao, when 5 grains grew without cultivation, when springs never dried, when animals reproduced abundantly, when humans lived long lives in perfect health. This was before sage kings taught agriculture, before civilization disrupted the natural order. Taoist philosopher Lao repeatedly refers to this lost paradise in the Tao Te Ching. When they lose sight of the Tao, they resort to virtue. When they lose virtue, they resort to benevolence. When they lose benevolence, they resort to righteousness. When they lose righteousness, they resort to propriety. Each step away from the original state represents further fall from paradise. The Aztecs preserved memory of Tamawan-chan, place of the mist and rain, the paradise where humanity was created, where gods lived, where first maize grew. The Florentine Codex describes it as a place of abundance where flowers grew in every color, where all things beautiful existed. From Tamawan-chan, humanity was sent forth into the world, separated from direct communion with the divine, forced to earn survival through labor. Aboriginal Australian peoples, whose oral traditions may extend back tens of thousands of years, speak of the dream time, that era when the world was soft and unformed, when ancestral beings walked the land, when humans could communicate with animals, when boundaries between species were permeable. The dream time ended when the world hardened into present state, when ancestral beings entered the landscape or ascended to the sky, when easy transformations of that primordial time became fixed. Humans were left to maintain songlines and laws, but could no longer participate in creation itself. Hindu tradition speaks of the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, the first and best of 4 ages. In this golden age, Dharma stood on 4 legs: fully established in the world. Humans lived for 100,000 years. There was no disease, no evil, no suffering, no labor. All needs appeared spontaneously. Then came the Treta Yuga, when Dharma lost one leg, when sacrifice and ritual became necessary. Then the Dvapara Yuga, when Dharma stood on only two legs, when good and evil were equally balanced. And finally the Kali Yuga, our present dark age, when Dharma limps on one leg, when ignorance and suffering dominate, when life is short and hard. Each age shorter than the last, each age worse than the one before, the pattern of decline from paradise everywhere. Persian Zoroastrian tradition preserves memory of Aryan Vaja, the seed of the Iranians, the original homeland created by Ahura Mazda, as first and best of lands, a paradise of perfect climate, abundant resources, where humans lived in harmony with the divine order. But Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, sent winter upon it. The people were forced to flee, to migrate seeking new homes in less perfect lands, paradise lost through cosmic struggle between order and chaos, between creative and destructive forces. Do you see the universality? Culture after culture, continent after continent, everyone remembers paradise. Everyone remembers the fall. Everyone preserves the story of abundance lost, of harmony broken. The universality of these paradise myths reveals something profound about human psychology and memory. These aren't just random stories. They follow too consistent a pattern. They preserve too many specific details. They appear in too many cultures that had no contact with each other. When we see the same story emerging independently in Mesopotamia, in Greece, in Scandinavia, in China, in India, in Persia, in Mesoamerica, in Aboriginal Australia, we're witnessing something more than coincidence. We're seeing the preservation of actual human experience, actual transformation, actual loss. The mechanism for this preservation is oral tradition, and we've dramatically underestimated how accurately oral tradition can preserve information across vast spans of time. Australian Aboriginal cultures have oral traditions describing coastal features, places where their ancestors lived, that are now underwater, that were flooded when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, 7,000, 10,000, even 12,000 years ago. Linguists and anthropologists studying these traditions have verified them against geological evidence. The stories describe specific bays, headlands, islands that existed before the flooding, that are now beneath the sea, that can be mapped using modern bathymetry. The accuracy is extraordinary. These aren't vague myths. These are precise geographical descriptions, preserved orally for hundreds of generations. If Aboriginal cultures can preserve such detailed information for 12,000 years, why couldn't other cultures preserve memories of the Ice Age world? Why couldn't the descendants of Doggerland's refugees preserve stories of the Great Plain that connected Britain to Europe? Why couldn't the survivors of the Persian Gulf flooding preserve memories of the River Valley paradise? The answer is, they could, and they did. The stories are there, encoded in the myths of Paradise Lost, in the accounts of golden ages and falls, in the persistent human conviction that we once lived better, more simply, in greater harmony with nature and each other. These stories aren't primitive superstition. They're sophisticated cultural memory. They're the oral history of the greatest climate transformation humanity has ever experienced. They're the preserved wisdom of ancestors who lived through apocalypse and survived to tell the tale. This level of consistency across cultures with no contact, that developed independently, that spoke different languages, and worshipped different gods, this suggests something deeper, something real underlying all myths, a shared human experience, a collective memory encoded in story, passed down through generations, reshaped by each culture, but preserving the same essential truth. We lived in paradise, and paradise was lost, not through moral failing, but through catastrophe, through climate change, through the ending of the Ice Age, through transformation from abundance to scarcity, From the hunter-gatherer paradise to the agricultural struggle, let's examine what life was actually like in the Ice Age world, in that hunter-gatherer paradise before the fall. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers in rich environments, Pacific Northwest, Australia, Southern Africa, reveal patterns that probably characterized Ice Age life: small bands of 20 to 50 individuals, connected through kinship and trade, to larger regional populations of hundreds or thousands, movement with the seasons, following resource availability, but not aimless wandering. These were people who knew their territories intimately, who had names for every hill and spring, who understood ecology with scientific precision passed down through generations. Their diet was remarkably diverse, more varied than agricultural peoples who depend on a few staple crops. They ate dozens of plant species, multiple kinds of game, fish and shellfish, insects, birds' eggs, wild honey. This diversity meant they were less vulnerable to any single food source failing, more resilient to environmental variation. Their health was generally good. Skeletal evidence from Paleolithic hunter-gatherers shows they were typically as tall as modern humans, often taller than early agriculturalists. Dental health was better, with fewer cavities, less gum disease. Signs of chronic disease were rare. Life expectancy at birth was lower due to infant mortality and accidents, but those who survived childhood often lived into their 60s or 70s, comparable to many historical agricultural societies. They had leisure time. Modern hunter-gatherers typically work 3 to 4 hours daily on subsistence activities. The rest is spent in social interaction, artistic pursuits, storytelling, music, rest. They don't accumulate possessions because they move regularly, but they accumulate knowledge, stories, relationships, cultural richness. They had sophisticated understanding of their environment. Australian Aboriginal peoples maintained detailed mental maps of territories spanning thousands of square kilometres. They knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which could be processed to remove toxins. They understood animal behavior well enough to predict movements and plan hunts. They read weather patterns, tracked seasonal changes, anticipated resource availability months in advance. Archaeological evidence reveals impressive technological sophistication. By 20,000 years ago, humans were creating sophisticated tools, microliths, tiny, precisely shaped stone blades hafted into composite tools, bone needles allowing the creation of fitted clothing, atlals, spear throwers that extended the range and power of projectiles, later, bows and arrows, fish hooks and nets, basketry and cordage, stone grinding tools for processing plant foods, and the art, the magnificent cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, created between 17,000 and 30,000 years ago, display artistic sophistication that rivals anything from historical periods. The ability to use perspective, to capture movement, to convey emotion through pose and expression. These weren't crude scratchings, these were masterworks. The Venus figurines found across Eurasia, carved from mammoth ivory, stone, fired clay, some showing remarkable attention to detail, others highly stylized, but all revealing aesthetic sensibilities, cultural transmission of artistic traditions, shared symbolic meanings. Musical instruments, bone flutes capable of playing complex melodies, found in European caves, dating to 40,000 years ago, drums, rattles, other percussion instruments leaving traces in the archaeological record, evidence of dance from footprints preserved in cave mud. These people had rich cultural lives. They sang, they danced, they told stories, they created beauty. This was paradise, not supernatural, not magical, but the natural world in its Ice Age abundance, providing everything needed without excessive labor. This was the world humans evolved in, the world our brains and bodies are adapted to, the world that shaped our deepest instincts about what life should be. The famous anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, after studying Amazonian hunter-gatherer groups, concluded they lived in what he called cold societies, societies that had achieved equilibrium with their environment, that had sophisticated knowledge systems, complex social structures, rich cultural traditions, but that consciously chose to remain stable rather than pursuing the kind of accumulation and growth that characterizes agricultural and industrial societies. They weren't primitive. They weren't simple. They were sophisticated human beings who had solved the problem of how to live well within the limits of their environment, how to have enough without needing more, how to thrive without growing, how to be fully human without conquering nature. And then it ended. The younger dryers struck. The climate collapsed. The megafauna went extinct. The Ice Age world died. And when it was over, when the survivors emerged, they faced a fundamentally different reality. The coastlines where their ancestors had thrived were drowning. The reliable patterns of resource availability were disrupted. The great herds that had sustained hunting for millennia were gone. Competition for remaining resources intensified. Populations that had grown during stable periods now exceeded what the changing landscape could support through traditional means. This is when agriculture emerged, not as innovation but as last resort, not as humans eagerly embracing progress, but as desperate people trying new strategies to survive in a diminished world. The people who first cultivated crops weren't celebrating. They were mourning the world they'd lost, mourning the abundance that was gone, mourning paradise. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let yourself imagine that lost world, not as something forever gone, but as something that lives within you, within all of us, in the deepest levels of memory and dream. Imagine the coastal plains beneath the Persian Gulf, where 4 rivers met in a landscape of impossible beauty, where humans thrived in abundance for thousands of years. Imagine standing there in that dawn world, feeling warm sun on your face, hearing the calls of birds whose species no longer exist, watching herds of animals moving across grasslands that are now salt water. Imagine Doggerland stretching from what will someday be England to what will someday be Denmark. But in that time, in that world, it's all one continuous landscape of gentle hills and winding rivers, of forests thick with game, of coastlines where your ancestors gather shellfish and fish, where children play in tide pools, where the old ones tell stories of the land and its spirits. Imagine Sunderland, twice the size of India, a tropical paradise supporting sophisticated cultures whose achievements we can only glimpse in the fragments that survived on the highlands. Imagine river valleys now beneath the Java Sea. Imagine cities we'll never find, knowledge lost when the waters came. Imagine the green Sahara, with its rivers and lakes, its grasslands and forests, its rock artists leaving behind thousands of images, documentary evidence of a world that seemed eternal, that seemed like it would last forever, until the rains failed, until the desert came, until paradise died. Imagine your own ancestors living in one of these paradises, perhaps on the coastal plain beneath the Persian Gulf, perhaps in Doggerland, perhaps in Sunderland, perhaps in the green Sahara, perhaps in some other drowned landscape whose name we'll never know. They lived well. They knew their world intimately. They had names for every plant and animal. They understood the weather, the seasons, the migrations, the flowering times. They could read the land like you read a book. They moved with the rhythms of nature, not against them. They worked a few hours each day. The rest was spent in leisure, in art, in music, in storytelling around fires under star-filled skies, in teaching children, in maintaining relationships, in simply being human in all its fullness. They were healthy, strong, vital. They lived long enough to become grandparents, to pass down knowledge, to maintain the accumulated wisdom of generations. They died peacefully, surrounded by family, returning to the earth that had sustained them. This was paradise, real paradise, not a fairy tale, not a fairy tale, not a theological abstraction, but actual human experience, actual lived reality, for thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years. And then it ended. The catastrophe came. The younger Dryas struck. The climate collapsed. The world transformed. The coastlines drowned. The green lands dried. The abundance disappeared. Paradise was lost, but not forgotten, never forgotten. The memory persisted, encoded in stories, passed down through generations, reshaped by each culture's worldview and theology, but preserving at the core the same essential truth. We lived in a better world, and that world was taken from us, not through our fault, not through our sin, but through forces beyond our control, through climate, through catastrophe, through the inexorable march of geological and cosmic time. The stories remember, Genesis remembers, the Sumerian myths remember, the Greek accounts of the Golden Age remember, the Norse tales of Etherville remember, the Chinese memories of primordial harmony remember, the Aboriginal Dreamtime remembers. Every culture everywhere remembers, because it's true, it happened. Paradise was real, the fall was real, the expulsion was real, the angel with the flaming sword, that's climate change, that's rising seas, that's the transformation of the world from abundance to scarcity, that's the barrier preventing our return, because you can't go back. Once populations have grown, once agriculture has been adopted, once civilization has begun, the angel bars the way. You are the descendant of survivors, people who lived through apocalypse, who adapted to catastrophe, who lost everything, and kept going anyway. Their resilience is woven into your DNA. Their courage flows in your blood, their refusal to surrender lives in your heart. But so does the memory of loss, so does the longing for what was taken, so does the dream of return, of recovery, of somehow finding the way back to the garden. Every spiritual tradition, every religion, every philosophy carries this dream. The hope that we can transcend the fallen state, that we can recover innocence without losing wisdom, that we can return to paradise without abandoning the knowledge that expelled us. The quest for enlightenment, for nirvana, for the kingdom of heaven, for the promised land, for utopia. These are all expressions of the same deep yearning, the yearning for Eden, for paradise, for the world we lost but never stopped longing for. Can we recover it? Not by going backward, not by returning to the hunter-gatherer life. We can't. We're too many, too dependent on agriculture and technology, too far down the path we were forced onto 12,000 years ago. But maybe we can go forward to something new, something that incorporates the wisdom of the old ways with the capabilities of the new, something that uses our knowledge not to dominate nature, but to restore balance, not to multiply without limit, but to find sustainable equilibrium, not to wall ourselves off from the wild, but to remember our place within it. Maybe the story of Eden isn't just about what we lost. Maybe it's also about what we might recover, not the specific paradise of the Ice Age world that's gone forever, drowned beneath risen seas, buried under shifting sands, transformed beyond recognition, but the essence of paradise, the abundance, the peace, the harmony between human needs and natural limits, the leisure, the health, the connection to place and season, and the rhythms that sustained our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. These aren't impossible things. These aren't fantasy. These are real, achievable, if we're willing to remember, willing to learn from the past, willing to see the Eden story not as naive mythology, but as profound wisdom about the human condition and our relationship with the world. The indigenous peoples who maintained the old ways into modern times, who resisted the agricultural transformation, who kept the hunter-gatherer wisdom alive, they have much to teach us about living within limits, about valuing leisure over accumulation, about maintaining balance with nature, and perhaps, just perhaps, that's why the Eden story persists, why every culture tells it, why we can't forget it, because at some level we know, we remember, we carry within us the knowledge of what we lost and the hope of what we might recover. Rest now, knowing that you carry within you the memory of paradise, that every human who ever lived carries that same memory, that we're all collectively trying to find our way back to the garden, trying to recover what was lost, trying to create in this fallen world something like the harmony that once existed. The rivers still flow, though their courses have changed. The seasons still turn, though the climate has shifted. The earth still offers abundance. If we're wise enough to receive it without destroying it, paradise isn't gone forever. It's transformed. It waits to be recognized in new forms. It calls to us in dreams and myths, reminding us of what we were, what we lost, what we might yet become. And in your sleep, you return there. We all do, every night, when consciousness relaxes its grip, when the knowledge of good and evil loosens, when we slip back into the oceanic feeling of unity with all things. In sleep, we recover something of the innocence, the wholeness, the harmony that characterized that lost world. Sleep is the nightly return to Eden, the temporary recovery of paradise, the brief restoration of what was lost when we ate from the tree of knowledge and became self-aware, separate, divided from nature, burdened with mortality and toil. You are part of that remembering, part of that journey, part of the long human story from Eden, lost to Eden, recovered, from innocence through knowledge to wisdom, from paradise through exile to return. Close your eyes now, let the day's concerns dissolve into the darkness. Let yourself sink into the soft embrace that receives all seekers, all wanderers, all those who long for home. You're returning now, even in sleep, even in dreams. You're finding your way back, back to innocence, back to wholeness, back to peace, back to the garden where it all began. The four rivers flow in your dreams tonight. The tree of life offers its fruit. The animals walk without fear. The earth provides abundance without toil. You are there. You have always been there, in the deepest part of yourself, in the place untouched by exile, in the paradise that cannot be lost because it lives within you, waiting, patient, eternal. Good night from Simply About Earth. Sleep well.